All right, bodacious bunnies. What we got to last time, just a quick review of what we had done. I was talking a lot about just kind of the mental process of setting up your application by creating this code layer and creating some frames and creating keyframes with these frame labels on them to kind of denote the different pages or screens of your application. In our case, we're starting with a home page and then a page for Marvin, Frodo, Muffin, and Flopsy here. So we have this. This is great. We have our buttons set up. We have also, besides just kind of setting up the layout across the main timeline of what you would want, we also have the third type of symbol, which was a movie clip. And we spent some time setting up these movie clips, which work similarly to graphic symbols in that when you go inside of them, they have just a regular timeline, but they're usually used for more grouping things together, as well as for interactive things that we would maybe talk to in the code the way we would talk to buttons. And you'll see some more examples of that a little later on. But for right now, we want to continue making this thing work, laying out the timeline and kind of getting started with organizing pages before you ever even make buttons work. So you can just kind of drag your playhead around and make things change on the timeline by keyframing in and keyframing out and moving keyframes around. We also went through all those publish settings as far as centering, making it responsive, and then doing the preloader and setting these images to export the image assets. Our images folder and our project folder kind of shows us all our individual bunny images plus the preloader here. Now, I keep going through this just because the whole organizing your stuff into a single folder, I can't stress enough how important that is, and being able to just kind of back that up somewhere. So ideally, all of you should have a local spot on your computer where you're working from, like your working directory, and then you should be saving this out to your drive somewhere so you have a backup. Anyway, you got your bunny website folder ready to go. My buttons FLA, there it is. There's my little happy face with my move, flip, and shrink. We're going to copy this code out again, so you just don't have to memorize it. So we only had to kind of remember what to do this first time, and then we can reference this and use that code later on. And this isn't cheating. This is the way programmers do things. Is, you know, at some point you've got to write something from scratch, but then as time goes on, you never ever really want to recreate the wheel. And you can always kind of glean things that you had done before or learned or struggled through in other projects, kind of copy them into newer projects. The longer you go making things, the more of a library of your stuff you'll have to kind of pull from. So that's what we're going to do here, is we're actually going to set this up in the exact same way. So if we remember looking at our buttons, in fact, I'm going to open up the actions panel here. Once again, you can, I always have mine just sitting here. It's part of my layout that I have saved. You can make your own layout under window workspaces, and then you can kind of create your own, or how do you create your own from here? I don't know. Anyway, there's a way, or you can use any of these regular ones. I've been on Essentials, really. I have a slight modification of that I named Chris, but that gives me my actions panel up here, and I just kind of click the word actions and it comes and goes. But I'm not sure if I've talked to you collectively about just how more productive it is to work on two screens. That, you know, maybe you may or not have that ability working from home with just a laptop. If it's something you've never done before, I would highly, highly recommend it. I sit here at my desk with my monitors, one screen, and the screen I'm actually sharing with you, or you're seeing this code here, is an external monitor. And having the ability to just kind of have like your tools and everything on one screen and your files on the other, it's really, really helpful. And a lot of times what I'll do is I'll actually have my actions panel dragged over on the other screen, so I can kind of see my timeline and see my stage at the same time I can see the code I'm writing. Or sometimes I'll just work on one screen and I'll make it come and go. But if you find yourself minimizing, switching programs, moving things all around a lot, it can be a lot more productive to try and find a way to work on 2 monitors, even if that's not something you can do right now. Further along in your career in digital media, you'll find that it's very commonplace and it's worth getting into sooner rather than later to kind of up your productivity and make things easier. So anyway, that being said, we're just going to look at it on 1 monitor because that's what I'm sharing. And we're going to look at the code here for a minute. And it looks a little complicated right now, but we wrote all of these notes for ourselves telling us exactly what's going on. We're stopping the timeline. We're creating a variable to represent the timeline so we can kind of talk to it. And then each of these was just one of the buttons where we're telling the button what to happen when you click. So we could just copy this whole thing, so we're going to end up using it a lot, but let's just take it a piece at a time. The first thing we want to do is let's just copy these first 2 lines, the stop command. You can keep the comment with it if you want. I'm going to in my case, but you don't have to. It's kind of your own preference. These comments are there for you just to organize things and write notes to yourself, right? So I'm copying this out of my buttons FLA. Once again, I find this code just by clicking on this very first keyframe on the code layer and then opening the actions panel. If yours isn't already up there, you can always go to Window Actions to find it. You can see there's a little F9 right there. That's what I do a lot too, is I'll just use F9 and it makes it appear and disappear real quick like that. But again, depending on your setup, you know, I'm at a desk with a keyboard right in front of me, so it's easy to do these hotkeys. Some of you may have like a Surface tablet or something where it's a little harder to pull up the keyboard, and you have to click a couple buttons to do that anyway. So whatever your method, just try and stick to it and try and get as productive as you can. It goes a long way as time goes on. All right, so we're going to copy the stop command and then go back over to our Bodacious Bunnies website, because right now, if I run this in the browser, it's just going to play through the whole thing and then just keep looping, because our timeline is just an animation right now. Isn't really doing anything. It's actually a frame-by-frame animation that just switches frames every half second right now. So what we want to do is we know that we want it to hold at the very beginning again, like this, on the home page, right? So we want the timeline to stop here, and we want the users to actually push a button to go somewhere. All right, so let's put the code on this frame 1, the same frame where I have that home layer. And right now it has no little lowercase a over it to show you there's code on it. But we're going to select that first frame on the code layer, open up our actions panel, and let's paste in that stop command. This.stop, open close parenthesis. The word this right now is representing the timeline. I know that could be a little confusing. That's just something in JavaScript. It's one of the first things that we learn when we're starting to develop things is the word this kind of changes what it references depending on where it's used. And I'll talk about that again when we start copying the button code, because inside of those button code functions, the word this suddenly changes its meaning. And it suddenly means the button that was clicked instead of the timeline. It can get confusing. You have to kind of remember that when you're telling the timeline what to do, which is why we create a variable for it. Go back to our buttons here. Now I'm going to go in and I'm going to copy this timeline variable. I'm going to paste that. I'm just using the tabs up here to switch between my buttons FLA and my website FLA. Paste that timeline variable in there too. Now, right now, we can test our movie and we can make sure this is working. You can see we've got that little lowercase a down here, which gives us that visual feedback that there is, in fact, code on this layer. All right, and if I test it, now this will work even without this variable. That variable is really not doing anything yet. We're just setting it. What's really happening is just the stop command, right? So if I run this, and it stopped, right? Not going anywhere. Okay, now before we go much further with just making these buttons work, I want to introduce to you guys the way in which we can debug our code. The browser gives us a tool that if something's wrong, it'll tell us what's wrong, And we can also send ourselves little messages, and I'll show you what I mean. So first off, ideally you would be using Chrome as your default browser, which is pretty easy to set up on Mac or Windows. If you have Safari, we just need to do an extra step here. I'll go ahead and open Safari, show you what I mean, is we just have to turn on the developer tools. So I believe it's in Preferences and Advanced. Yes, here it is. I'm already right there. So if you open your Safari Preferences and go to Advanced, there's this little check mark right here for Show Develop Menu in Menu Bar. All right, so check that. As long as you have that checked, then what I'm about to do in Chrome will do the same thing in Safari. Okay, so what you want to do is in your browser, I guess it'll work anywhere. You just right click anywhere. It can be over the movie or outside of the movie. You get a slightly different thing depending on your browser plugins and stuff like that. But in any of them, you should be able to see the word inspect. You can click on inspect, and that will open. It will basically open the hood and show you the engine beneath this web page and showing you what's doing it. Now, when you first do it, it's probably going to be on the side like this, or maybe the other side like this. I think it defaults like this. You can leave it however you want. There's a little 3 dots right here in the upper right next to the close button. If you hit the X, it'll close. You can right click and choose inspect again. Of course, I'm all about the hotkeys, so you can even use F12 as a hotkey right here. That will open and close content. But regardless, it's a little easy to remember at first, just to right click, choose inspect. And I like to keep mine at the bottom. I don't really like it on the side, so I would recommend it. You click these little 3 dots, and there's these little icons where you can dock it in different places. And I like to dock mine at the bottom because I think it's a little easier to see what we're trying to see here. Now, later on, we'll use this panel to actually like preview what our app's going to look like on different phone screens, different sizes and stuff. But for right now, what this is doing here is we've talked before about how there's 3 different programming languages that make up the web. All right, so HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Luckily, Adobe Animate does all of the HTML and CSS for us. We can just ignore 2 programming languages. And then what we're writing in, what we're learning to write our button code in, is JavaScript. Now, when we first open this inspector, this developer panel, there's all kinds of tabs and all kinds of windows and crazy stuff going on. But in essence, what it's showing you is this big area here showing us all of the HTML. That's in our page, and we can see, you can select our actual canvas tag that is holding everything, our HTML canvas that we're building through Animate. Over here is the CSS that's dealing with it. But what's important when we open this is we're not even on it, we're on this Elements tab. We don't want to be on this Elements tab. We want to click the Console tab. Open up this console. All right, and this console is the JavaScript console. And this will allow us to see bugs in our code. When an error happens, it's going to pop up in here, and it will give us some clues as to what's wrong. And we can send ourselves little notes and messages to help figure things out and help debug code. And that's what we're going to do right now. So the first step is just to make sure that you have your project published. I want to make sure that we've got our website, it's got the stop command, and I'm just publishing it with command return like we have before. And you may have noticed through some of our testing and whatnot so far that every single time you go back and make a change and add things and hit command return, it opens in a new window every single time, or a new tab. And sometimes I'll end up with like 10 of these tabs and I'll have to keep closing them, and that can be kind of annoying. Well, especially once you open up the console, go right click, inspect, and then click on the console here and get to the JavaScript console. A lot of times when you're debugging your code or working on something, you don't want it to keep opening a new tab and have to keep opening the console. You want to just leave this one open and be able to just refresh it and have it updated. And there is a way to do that. I'll show you how to do that here shortly. So just make sure that you have a version open in a web browser with your console open that you just published from your Animate file. And then go back to the Animate file. And now we're going to play with this variable for a minute. I think it's pretty clear what the stop command's doing, right? And it's just saying this current timeline, just stop. And that's keeping it from going anywhere. Now, before we actually add button codes, we can click these buttons to jump around like we did the other one. We're going to ignore this variable for right now. We'll monkey with that in a minute. But let's go down here and, you know, maybe I'm going to make myself a comment, a couple lines, tell me what I'm doing. Write a message to the browser console. Okay, and then maybe even here, I'm going to put in parentheses, right click and choose inspect in the browser window. So I'm even reminding myself how to get to this console, right? How about to open, I'll keep all lowercase, JavaScript console. All right, so a good place to give ourselves a real obvious note. So this piece of code we're going to do writes a message to the browser console, and we right click and choose inspect in the browser window to open JavaScript console. Okay, perfect. Now, to actually do it, the command is to say, let me go below this, is to say console.log. And then we put an open close parenthesis and a semicolon like we do at the end of most function calls or methods are called sometimes in programming that are variable. And then we're calling a specific function that's kind of built in. All right, now to actually write something inside of these parentheses, actually I'm going to bump up, I'm going to go into my Animate, Preferences, Edit Preferences, Code Editor, and I'm going to double my size to 24 font so you can see this code a little better. There we go. Now it's massive. You can see that better. And now my message is super long and scrolling over here, but that's fine. So now console.log, and inside of that, we want to put quotes, okay? And then anything in here, hello world. It's a very common programmer thing when you're first testing something is to use hello world, but you can write whatever you'd like in there. Whatever we put in here is going to actually write to that console. All right, and I'll show you what I mean. So now that we've got this, if I were to hit command return and open a new tab and then open the console again, yeah, it would work and I'd see my little message. But I would rather leave my one that's open here and use this and just refresh it. To do that, all we have to do is publish the movie. We just have to go to File, Publish. And that's doing the exact same thing as if we opened our More settings under Publish Settings and clicked Publish. Same thing, all right? So I usually just go to File, Publish. And that's going to publish everything, write all the files. It just doesn't automatically start a local web server and open it in your browser. But if you already have it open in your browser, then all we have to do is refresh, and it shows me the most recent version, and hello. Now you may have some random stuff that shows up here outside of what you put in here. I have a couple browser plugins that are talking about things. I've got this weird runtime error. It doesn't really matter. You can ignore stuff that just comes up for right now. But what you should see is your little message that you wrote yourself here. Hello world. Now right now we're just writing it right away, but there's certain situations where we could like write ourselves a message when a button's clicked to make sure the button's actually going to be clicked. Or if we make a mistake in something, it's gonna crap out and let us know down here. And we'll take a look at that here shortly when we start adding our button code. Cool, so console log. This is a big deal. I know I'm taking a while going through it, but this is like to be able to talk to yourself and send messages to the browser console, a completely different program, as you're writing your application, because ultimately this browser is what end users are going to look at your application through on the internet. This kind of gives you some under the hood stuff to kind of look at the engine and talk to the engine and tap it with wrenches and stuff. Okay, so we have our console log. Now let's talk about this variable for a minute. We are creating a variable that we can use in other places that represents the current timeline. Now at this level, at the very beginning, the word this actually stands for the timeline. So we could say this dot stop. But later on, again, when we get back into our actual button code, once we get inside of these functions, the word this doesn't mean that anymore. So when we want to play our timeline, we have to actually reference it. All right, so it's just a little funky thing, but getting used to the idea of storing information in a variable and then using it in another place is a pretty powerful concept in programming to start to wrap your mind around. Because a lot is done with just storing things in variables, and then those variables can change and do all kinds of things with them. We could actually use this variable instead of this, as long as we define it first. All right, I'm going to show you what I mean, and I'm going to show you how the console is going to yell at us if we do something wrong. All right, so what I want to do is I'd like to try and just say timeline.stop. But the problem is this should cause an error. We'll see if it actually errors out. I'm not sure if it will. Because timeline doesn't exist yet. It goes from the top down, right? It's like a set of instructions. You have to make sure, now this should work if I cut this and put it above it. So now it knows what timeline is, and now the timeline should stop. But I'm going to try and see what happens if I try and call this before it's even defined. It might do the thing, it might not. I just use some hotkeys, but I'm going to file, publish. Try this out, refresh this. Oh yeah, sure enough, it is throwing, look at this big ugly red error. So I'd like all of you to try that actually. I'll go back, do this a little slower. So before it just said this dot stop, right? And that works just fine. But as soon as I change it to timeline.stop, thinking that might work, but I haven't actually defined the timeline yet. If I do that, go to File, Publish, go back and refresh my page here, not only does the timeline not stop, see it just continues to blow through, so that didn't work, but it's giving me this big ugly error that just totally gave me a whole bunch of stuff. In fact, I'm going to refresh my page and I can see that, yeah, it's happening. I think it's even adding a new one every single time it goes back to the beginning of the timeline. But it actually tells me, it's this error right here that you should all kind of see happen. But it does actually try and tell me what's wrong. There's a whole bunch of lines under it and a whole bunch of links and a bunch of garbage. But all you really have to worry about is what it says. You can actually, what it says on the very top layer, on the very top line, and then this link way over here to the right. So it's telling me some kind of uncaught type error, cannot read property stop of undefined. Anytime you see of undefined, that basically means that it's looking for something it can't find. Now I can click on this link over here and it'll actually take me to the exact line in my code that it's having a problem with, and it puts a little X next to it right here. So it's telling me, okay, this timeline.stop, it doesn't like, okay? And that takes me to this sources thing. I can click back on console to go back to the error. All right, so it's really important as you start to write your own code and write your button code and try and get things to work, it's important to be able to kind of work with this console open and see if errors pop up. Because that's what I do, is I go through and see if it's giving me an error, and I see if I can figure out what the error is trying to say. Cannot read stop of undefined. It's showing me it's at this exact line. So I can go back and I can think, oh, duh, undefined. It doesn't know what timeline is yet, right? So now let's cut this whole variable and put it at the very top. Okay, so now it's defined, this variable named timeline actually means this, which at this point is the current timeline. And now we can use that variable and tell it to stop instead of just using this dot stop, and it should work. So as long as I'm defining that first and then using it, file, publish. Now I'll go back here, go back to my console with that big ugly red error mess and hit refresh. And now it's working again. Okay, so now it's stopped and I don't see that big messy giant stack of an error, and I still see my little hello world message right here. In fact, maybe instead of hello world, one thing I'm also doing that I should mention, I'm switching between programs very quickly like this. I keep switching between my browser and Animate. I personally use the keyboard and use, on a Mac, it's the Command and Tab keys that I'm holding Command with my thumb right now, and then with my finger I'm using Tab. I believe it's Alt-Tab on Windows, and it just lets me tab between all the programs that I have open and choose the other one. And if I just real quickly hit Command-Tab, it switches me between those two. It's just a little trick that I use every day, basically. There's other ways. I mean, you can just move your cursor down and find your program like this, or I know the Mac has special things. You can like take 3 fingers and drag up on your thing, which will kind of zoom out and show you all the programs you have open, and you can pick them like that. There's a bunch of different ways to do the same thing, but you might want to cultivate one of them and kind of get fast at switching between programs when you're working like this. All right, so I'm going to change my log. Instead of hello world, I'm going to say Bodacious Bunnies. This lets me know it's there. So maybe I'll publish it again now. File, publish. Going back, refreshing, and it says Bodacious Bunnies. So again, we can write to the console. And maybe I'll move this down to another line, give it a 2-line, maybe even, yeah, that works. Give it a 2-line comment there. You can have as many lines as you want. In fact, you can even, this isn't really important, but while we're talking about comments, I'll show you. You can open a comment like this, whoops, with a slash and an asterisk. Whoops, put it down here. And then you can type as many lines as you want in whole paragraphs, and then close the comment with asterisk line. And then you can start coding again. It won't be a comment anymore. So you can do what's called a block comment this way, but we don't really need to in this class necessarily. We won't have that many comments, but you might see that in another place. I typically just put 2 slashes at the beginning of each line, even if I'm gonna break them down onto 2 lines like this. That's okay. You can have as many as you want. All right, so we can write to our console. We know how to open our console, and we're starting to wrap our brains around the variable thing, how it's just a placeholder keeping track of something that may change, right? Now, in this case, if I go back between my buttons in my website, to illustrate that variable and to show us how an error will pop up if we're trying to reference something that it can't find, we're kind of doing this in 2 separate ways. So in our original buttons one, we didn't worry about the variable yet, and we just did this dot stop, which is perfectly fine. There's other places where we'll probably just use this dot stop just to stop the timeline in certain spots. But then we made a variable that we could start using in our button code. But in this website example, we kind of went the other way, where we made our variable first, and now we're using our variable to say stop. So we do the same thing, but it's kind of, it's worthwhile to point out how you can use a variable to reference something and just use that name instead. Just kind of why I'm doing it slightly differently. All right. So now let's go on and actually make these buttons work, shall we? Before we actually code anything, the most important part, which I've mentioned a couple of times when we were setting these up, I'm going to mention it again, is you must have an instance name on each of your buttons, okay? So what we did it when we created the buttons, which I usually do, but just double check and make sure they're there. because this is the most commonly missed piece of making buttons work, is not having this instance name. Is it must have this, or else you'll always get a big error stack saying cannot find whatever of undefined because it can't find the button you're looking for. All right, so that's in your properties panel in this little instance name box, and I've got it all lowercase named button 1, button 2, button 3, and button 4. All right, so now, knowing that we've got those ready to be talked to in code, now we can actually get the code to code the buttons. So far, all we've done is stop the timeline so it waits for the user to press the button, set up a variable to use it, and then we wrote ourselves a little note. Now, sets up buttons. All right, I'm just going to make a little comment there to set up the buttons. I'm going to comment a little differently than our buttons one here. With our buttons one here, I was setting comments on each individual button thing, telling it which specific button we're setting up and then exactly what it's doing. I'm not going to use all of those this time. What I want you to do is I want you to go back and make sure you copy just one little block of button code. Okay, whether you want to copy the top comment or not is up to you. I'm not going to in this case. What's important though is that not only do you get down far enough to copy the actual line that moves the timeline, but go down and make sure that you get this last, that's another common mistake, is make sure you get this last little end curly bracket, end parenthesis, semicolon, which technically kind of closes the function and makes it all ready to go. All right, so copy all of that. And we can go back to our website thing. And now I'm going to paste it in here, directly under sets up buttons. And after I paste it, I'm actually going to get rid of this comment so that this version of my button code is pretty much as simple as possible, right? So I've got this sets up buttons thing. And now I've got this button code that what I need to do is, first of all, because I've used it before, and I could just grab it, and I understand that the comments are separate from the actual code, and the comments can come and go however I please to write myself notes, which I totally recommend you do. I mean, if you need to write different notes than what I'm writing, you know, write yourself your own notes as you're coding to kind of tell you what's going on. But what we need to do now is we don't need to memorize all of this. We just need to copy it, but what we need to memorize is kind of the different pieces of it and figure out exactly how, like what we need to change, okay? So first of all, we see the word this. Now this, at this top level, when we're not inside of a function, it does actually refer to the timeline. So we could leave this as this, or we could use the word timeline right here, because they mean the same thing at that level. Say this.button1 or timeline.button1, either one. Now what won't work is if we just start with button 1. It will not be able to find this. Even though we have an instance name, it must know what timeline or what object you're talking about to go find where that button is, because it can be in any number of places. So if we just have the name of the button, it won't work. We have to have the location and then the name. So either timeline dot, or in this case, I'm just going to leave it as this dot button, which is saying on this current timeline, which our code is here, so we know that, you know, basically the buttons live here, that it's going to say at this location. So those buttons better, like when you're writing button code, for example, it wouldn't work to put button code actually on page 1 here because there's no button there and it wouldn't be able to find it, right? It's really important that wherever you write button code, even though we've only done it on frame 1 right here, wherever we write button code, that the button actually lives in that same location. So you would be able to kind of go down vertically and find the button, or at least be on the location where your button code is, and your button should be on the screen somewhere that you should be able to click and see an instance name. That's how the code finds it, is that button must be there in the same location. In this case, they are. We're sitting on the first frame, and that's where we have the timeline stopped, and that's where we want to wait until the user presses one of these before we jump, okay? So now I'm going to go back into my code, and now I'm just going to leave it this or timeline, and then dot button 1. Now this is the name of the button, And it just so happens that we named the button the same instance name as we did in our actual buttons thing. Again, so instead of calling this move button and then calling this one like bunny1 button or something like that, by keeping our object names more generic, it's a little easier to reuse. So because that's the same name, we don't even need to change that. We say, okay, so this dot button1 on click. So when we click on it, then we create this function, which whatever we put inside of this function is what's going to happen. Okay, so in this case, now this is why we have originally this variable, is because if I were to just say, because right, so far this means the timeline, right? So if we were to say this dot stop right here, it works because it knows it's talking about the timeline. This dot button works because it knows we're talking about the timeline. So it would seem intuitive that this dot go to and play move, well, actually we need to change it to page 1 and go to and stop. I'll change that in a minute. You would think that this would work to tell the timeline what to do, but it doesn't. That's the funky thing in JavaScript, and one of the first things you learn as a coder is that the word this changes its scope. So once you're inside of this function, the word this now suddenly refers to the button that was clicked on. So telling the button to go to and play somewhere doesn't make any sense. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to tell the timeline, right? So that, again, is why we created this variable, so we can use it inside of these button functions and say timeline, which is what we're talking about, dot go to and play move. Now, this is the part we really have to change. So I do realize I'm talking about a lot of concepts here and going really slowly with it, but that's on purpose because we'll, as we do this more and more, I'll do it quicker, and hopefully you'll kind of remember some of the concepts and why this is all happening. So far, this is pretty much exactly what we copied from the buttons one. I got rid of the comments, but I haven't changed anything, right? I just got rid of the comments and change those a little bit. This current timeline, that works. Button 1, that is what one of our buttons is called. And we actually, that's this button, and this is going to have to go to page 1, right? This is Marvin's page. So that's what we need to change this line to, is we say timeline.go to and play, and inside of these quotes needs to match exactly down to the capital, which is why we don't use capital letters and we don't use spaces when we name things. This needs to match what's on the timeline, page 1. All right, so if I do this, this is actually going to work, but it's only going to kind of work. I'll show you what I mean. So change it to timeline.go to and play, page 1. And now if I publish my movie, oops, file, publish, go back over here, I can leave this open. In fact, it's probably a good idea while I'm coding to leave this console open. And I'm going to refresh it. And I can see it says Bodacious Bunnies. And if I click my button, it actually goes there. Now it actually continues playing and then loops in the timeline, which is a problem. I don't want it to go to all the pages. I just want it to go to my one page Marvin. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my code, and I guess one thing I'm going to do is just going to add ready here. So it tells me in the console, Bodacious Bunnies ready. Okay. And then down here, what I want to do is right now, so far when we were playing our animations from our button timeline, we were telling the timeline to go to and play move, go to and play flip. Down here, we would tell it to find this and then play through the animation, and then we would manually stop it at the end with a this dot stop here, right? Well, in this case, we don't want it to play these. We're not playing animations. We want the animation to just jump here. Now, what we could do is we could leave it as is. We could leave this saying timeline.go to and play, and we could actually put a stop command right here on page 1 to stop it. So once it gets there, it would stop and not blow through all the other pages and then loop back to the beginning. Instead of that, we can change this command. Instead of go to and play, this can be go to and stop. Now you want to make sure that you have a capital S here. This is usually what's called camel case. I think I explained that a little bit. This is just something programmers do, is make like uppercase without spaces in this way. But as long as you say timeline.goto and stop page 1, now if I publish it, file, publish, refresh, and now when I click my button, it goes there and stops. So it worked. Now, of course, I am in the dreaded interface black hole where, as of right now, I have no way to get back. I am just stuck with Marvin, and Marvin is stuck with me. And I can hit refresh, try it again, but we're just kind of stuck here, which is fine. We'll go in and add a little back button. But to set up the other buttons now, I'm just going to select this entire 3 lines of button code, and I'm just going to copy it 3 more times because there's 4 buttons. I like to put a space in between just to clean it up, doesn't matter. And I could, in theory, put comments next to each one telling what each individual button is doing. I could say, you know, this is going to Marvin's page and this is going to Frodo's page. But, you know, sometimes I don't need to comment everything. It's just kind of whatever you feel comfortable with, but feel free to put as many comments as you want. But in this case now, I just need to change on each of these. I need to change the button. So this dot button 2, I need to go to and stop page 2. This dot button 3, need to go to and stop page 3. This dot button 4, go to and stop page 4. And again, that's why we're keeping these naming conventions, that we actually named our button instances and we were able to name our actual frame labels. And just having them generic, but having them kind of match up makes it easier when we're coding just to keep track of what we're trying to do. All right, so sets up buttons. And now each of these buttons, when I click on each individual one, it should go to and stop that specific page. So I'm going to test it real quickly, and then I'll come back to this and file publish. Go back to my browser where my console is sitting here open. I'm going to refresh, and now, again, each one you click on, you're going to get stuck, and you'll have to refresh again until we add a back button. But for right now, there's Frodo, there's Muffin, and there's Flopsy. And now all of our buttons work. I'm going to go back here. So the top, you kind of see the timeline, the stop command, the log, but what's most important is these buttons. Kind of leave it right here so you can see that. See if you can just get those buttons working, and you are now no longer stuck to the confines of linear animation and linear thought. You can now be an interactive badass and do things kind of in your own order, your own way, with your own timing, with your own interactive timeline, and have the user become a part of what's happening rather than just sitting back and watching. It's a pretty powerful step here. So we are stuck and we want to make a back button to be able to get out. All right. Now we're going to make the back button in a particular way for a particular reason, to show you a different way to make buttons actually control different timelines. So far we've made buttons in both our original buttons FLA, our move, flip, and shrink. I'm actually going to close that. I don't need that anymore. And then even here, we're kind of doing it the same way, just instead of go to and play, we're using go to and stop. We used our timeline variable a little differently, but for the most part, we're still just on our main timeline, right? Now, as we introduce the concept of movie clips, which have their own timeline, this is where we could, for example, have one movie clip page and have like a whole bunch of, like, once I'm in here, I could add a whole bunch of frames out here if I wanted, and I could add like Marvin's entire life story here. This could be a timeline of Marvin growing up and being the best bunny he could be. And I could even have like other buttons here to jump around on this timeline. We could all treat it the same way. So it doesn't matter what timeline you're on, you can always put a code layer and put buttons and kind of make stuff work within that timeline. When it will become very powerful for you, when you start to understand how you can use movie clips to create new timelines and create whole new areas for animation and buttons and interactivity, and kind of nest those inside of other timelines. It can get very, I don't know if any of you have ever seen the movie Inception. It can get very Inception-like with the different levels as you keep getting deeper and deeper, nesting different timelines. But it ultimately gives you a lot of freedom and a lot of power to do a lot of different things while only using the same button code over and over again. Now, what we're going to do with this back button is we're going to set it up inside of these movie clips so that we're going to tell a timeline that's not the same timeline that the button lives on what to do. I'll show you what I mean. So the easy way, we're going to do this kind of a hard way so I can illustrate this process for you, and we'll make things down the road easier. But the easy way to make a back button would be for us just to, we've already got our buttons layer, and we've already got all these buttons here, and then we've got a keyframe here. As soon as page 1 starts, that right now is a blank keyframe, and that persists across all these pages. So what I could do is we could just throw a back button here. I'll call this square, this rectangle our back button for now. You don't have to do this, I'm just kind of showing you something. And now all of a sudden, because of that keyframe, now that back button doesn't show up on the home page, but it does show up on all the other pages. So in theory, I could make this a symbol, and then I could put button code on it, telling it to go to and stop home, right? But the problem with that is we don't know which page the user is going to go to, okay? So if we start at the home page, and let's say they click on Frodo and jump here first. So we've got our button here, but the question would be, okay, well, where do we put our button code? Because, you know, if we put it on page 1, where we first had our button show up, and the user jumps to page 2, they're never going to get to that spot where the code is, right? So we would have to put like this back button code on every single page, and then we wouldn't want it to like double up as you jump around, and there's issues we would run into kind of not knowing where the user's gonna go. Okay, so a safer way to do this, even though it'll make our code have an extra step to it, is we don't want to put it on the main timeline. I'm just going to get rid of this. We're going to put our button inside of our movie clip. Now, we're just going to do it in the first one and set it all up and get it working and position it and everything. And then we're going to be able to copy it and just kind of paste it into the other pages without having to redo everything. I'll show you how that works. So again, kind of this common thread of let's set this up and build it on one, and then kind of copy it all the other places that we need to use it. So let's start by going inside of page 1. So what I mean by that is take your timeline, go to your pages. I've still got my pages layer kind of highlighted here, and go to where it switches to Marvin here, and then double click. I'm double clicking on the image. You can double click on the image or the title to go inside of the page 1 movie clip. And we can see our breadcrumb trail up here with scene 1 and then page 1. And we can see I still have a bunch of frames here that I added. I'm going to get rid of these. I don't need these. Shift F5. I've just got my one frame with one layer that says name, and that's got my title on it, and then one layer that says image, and that's got my image on it. All right, I'm actually going to lock these 2 layers because I don't want to accidentally nudge them or mess them up or anything. And now inside of this, we're going to make 2 more layers. All right, I'm going to make a layer called back, and then a layer called code. What's important though is that as you name things, you think about them. You don't want to just leave things unnamed and have chaos in your layers and your symbol names and everything. So it'll be much, much more difficult when you go to start coding and tying things together. It's really important that you keep some kind of consistency and organization as you create these different objects and items. Now, we'll get to the code layer, but first we need to actually make our button. So make sure we're on the back layer. And I'm going to create a button now. that says back. In fact, I'm going to use a text only button, and I'm going to actually copy and paste it from the name because I want it to be like basically the same font. I just want to match this a little easier than creating it again. So if I unlock my name layer, select my name, copy it, I'm going to lock my name layer again and go back to my back layer, which is what I named for my back button. And I'm going to paste it. All right, just sticks it in the middle somewhere. I'm going to put it up here, and I'm going to name it back, but I'm going to give it this little less than symbol in front of it, so it looks like a little arrow pointing back like that. Just typed that in. All right, I'm going to kind of drag it over here and nudge it and make sure that it's right at the same level. Looks like it is. Again, I'm using the arrow keys to go 1 pixel, shift and arrow keys to go 10 pixels. And I do this a lot. I just kind of nudge things around. I'm nudging it to the edge and nudging it back about 30 pixels or so. That looks like a good spot for our back button. Pretty common place. All right, so we have our text here that says back. And now we want to make a button symbol out of this. So I'm going to use F8. You could use the convert to symbol or modify convert to symbol, or you could, actually it doesn't really have the convert to symbol as you're using text on the properties panel. So you may need to go to modify, convert to symbol, or just do it the easy way and use F8, gives you the convert to symbol dialog box. And now I'm just going to name it back, make sure it's a button, hit OK. And peek at my library and see that, okay, I've got my folder filled with, now I've got my folder filled with images, I've got my original home page, button 1, 2, 3, and 4, and I've got my page 1, 2, 3, and 4 movie clips. So our library is starting to build with these elements. Now we've got our back button here. Again, most important step is always, 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 whenever you create a button, just do it right away when you create it, give it an instance name. Most of the time, the instance name can be the exact same name that you name it in the library, but sometimes you may be using multiple versions of the same button and have to give them different instance names. But in this case, we just have our one back button, and we're naming it back in our instance name, so when we go to talk to it in code, we can. Okay, now let's go inside of our back button and make some changes to that. So we're going to double click inside of the back button, and now we are 3 levels of inception deep. We've got scene 1 is the main timeline, and then from scene 1 we went inside of page 1, inside of this movie clip. You can see our breadcrumb trail up here, and then we went 1 more level into the back button. So I'm going to jump up and do that again. I'll go all the way back up to scene 1. It's our main timeline. I can double click to go inside of the Marvin page. And then once I'm in the page, I've got all these layers. Now I can double click to go inside of my back button. Now, it's important before we even make our back button like code it, that it's always important just to set up your button states. Now, there's a couple of interesting things when using a text as a button, which is really common. Before, we had a text label on our original flip, move, and shrink buttons, but they were still just rounded rectangles. And our buttons in this project, they're just images with shape outlines and fills and stuff. We don't really have any text. If we were to use text only as a button, there's something interesting we have to do with the hit state, and I'll show you what I mean. First off, we can set the down state. I'm not even going to set the over. In fact, and because there's only 1 layer, I'm just going to leave it named layer 1. That's fine. I could change it to say text or something like that, but I'm just going to leave it, which I usually do unless there's more than 1 layer. If there's more than 1, then I usually start to name them. The over state, what it looks like when the user rolls over it, I mean, it's okay to have something, but it's not as important as having an actual down state. Actually, now that I think about it, well, let's start by giving ourselves frames on all of the states, right? That's always the first step. Sorry, I forgot about that. So I just used F5, or you can just insert frame, not keyframe, but frame, so that you can actually get to the up, over, down, and hit state. right? Now, let's put a keyframe on the over state. I'm actually going to set the over and the down state to the same thing. That's really common for me to do that when it's just a simple button. I'm going to use F6 to keyframe that over state. And the way to do that is if I just keyframe the over state and then don't do anything to the down state is naturally going to be the same. Okay, so if I'm on, we'll make a change first. What I usually do with a simple button is I just make it 50% transparent. Like if I don't want to change the color or make a different graphic, a lot of times is a very simple kind of visual cue that, okay, you're interacting with this button. I will just take it and make it 50% transparent. So right now I've got this white fill over here. Again, I just put a keyframe on my over state, select my text, and then over in the properties panel here next to the white fill, I can take this 100%, make it 50%, and that will make it semi-transparent. So now I can switch between my up and my over state to see that. And now the down state is the same thing. If I were to just switch between them, because this over keyframe is persisting across. The difference is on a laptop or a computer, a regular desktop, I will be able to roll over and see this happen. But if I'm using a touch screen where rollover doesn't exist, as soon as I touch the button, then I'm going to see that to give me that visual feedback that, hey, I have touched this button, which is important. You don't want a button that just has no states on it. That's not very professional. But a lot of times on a simple button, I will just leave the over and the down state the same. So on a computer, you roll over and you click it, and you don't see anything when you actually click down, but that's okay. Your rollover kind of takes care of that visual feedback for you. And then the down state clicking, you'll see, you'll see that change happen the first time when you actually touch your screen on a mobile device. So the trick though is the hit state when it comes to using text for a button. I'll show you what I mean. So let's go ahead and publish our movies now. I'm going to file publish. I'm just continuously leaving the one I already have open with the console open. It's just good practice to do that, but you can publish it to a new tab, and we don't really need the console right now if you don't want. You can just open it and close it to your liking when you're trying to find bugs in your code that may not be working, see what kind of error it's throwing. In fact, I'll just close it for now. All right. I'm going to refresh so I see the newest thing. And now I'm going to click on this button to get me to Marvin. I'm going to play with my back button, which isn't coded yet. It doesn't do anything. I can see my rollover. But what's important to notice is that I can't, like I have to be rolled over the actual glyph of the text. Like I could be in the middle of the A and clicking, and my button's not going to fire because it doesn't know that this whole thing is meant to be the button. It only is picking up the actual shapes. And that's a common mistake when it comes to using text as a button that we have to fix. Now, the way to fix it is just to put something in the hit state. Remember, the hit state is what represents what the actual button area is, okay? So I can leave this text there. Either way, I'm gonna wanna keyframe the hit state. So we know we're gonna wanna put something different here. So I'm gonna keyframe that, F6. So my up is my regular back text, and then my over is my 50% transparent, which also carries over to my down state. So my over and down are same. And now my hit state is keyframed, and all I really need to do is just draw a box bigger than this text to represent the hit state. Now, you can just draw it on top of the text. I personally like to delete that because I like to only have what I need on the keyframe. So now I've got nothing in my hit state, which isn't good. I want to take a box now, and usually when I'm just drawing a hit state or a mask or something, which I'm going to show you shortly, I like to have no stroke, and just like a solid red fill or something. Looks like I need to set my color back up to 100%. But what I'm doing here is I selected the rectangle tool, and now I'm working in the tool properties, in the properties panel, and I just set the stroke to be the little white square with a line through it, telling me I do not want a stroke, which is the outline of the shape. I don't care about an outline. I just want the fill, just the middle of the rectangle. I set it to bright red because it's not going to show up. It's just like a construction thing for me. And then I set my opacity back to 100%. Now I can draw a nice big box around where that button is. All right, I might need to kind of go back and forth and see that's a little bigger than it needs to be, but who cares? It's plenty big, so the user won't have any problem as long as you're not running into other buttons. Maybe I'll make it a little bit smaller. You can use the free transform tool. Hold Alt to get this side. Doesn't really matter. You don't have to do this part. I'll get it a little smaller, and then I'm even going to take the step of opening up the Align panel, having Align to Stage Set, and centering it right on that registration point. So now if I go back and forth, okay, now I can see that with my button states, I can see that red square covers that nicely. Okay, so now that I've got that set up, if I go back, File, Publish, now that I added that hit state, refresh, go back into Marvin's page here, and now the entire area, even a little bit outside of it, just wherever that block is representing the button instead of just the individual text. All right, so it's really important, again, just when using text for buttons, that you be sure and give it that hit state. Then you usually do want some kind of visual feedback on your over and down as well. All right, so we got our buttons set up. Now let's make this bad boy actually work. And we'll copy it to the other ones. I'm still inside my button, but I don't need to be anymore. This was all the button setup I needed, giving it its states and its hit state. So I'm going to go back up just one level back to page 1. So I'm still inside of page 1. If you accidentally go too far and get yourself in the main timeline, just go make sure you're on the page 1 label where you see Marvin, double click to go back in. So we're inside of page 1 where we should see image, name, back. Our back button should also have our back instance name as well. And I'm going to go ahead and lock that. And now it's time to write the code. Okay. Now let's go ahead and copy our code from one of the other places where we used it. Again, so we don't have to memorize it, and we can just change the parts of it that need to be changed. All right, so I'm actually going to go up to scene 1, bring my timeline, make that a little larger so we can see a little more of it. There we go. So I'm back up to scene 1, and now I'm going to select my home page code frame, keyframe here, frame 1, where we have all of our button code. I'm going to open that up, and I can see my variable and my stop and all of this good stuff. Let me think about this. I think we're going to want the timeline variable in this case. Yep. So let's just copy this timeline variable. You can copy the comment with it if you want. So copy that, and then I'm going to go back to page 1, go inside, and I'm going to select that code keyframe, open up my actions. I'm going to paste that var timeline equals this. All right, now I'm going to go back and steal a piece of the button code. I'm going to go all the way back again. And I'm kind of doing this in a long form way just to get you used to navigating your timeline. Get used to going back up to the main timeline, grab a piece of code from the home page, go back into a page. I'm kind of doing a little of that on purpose, jumping back and forth here to get you used to moving around. We're not going to need the stop because there's only one frame in our current movie clip. If it had a timeline that had more frames and it was plain, then we might want to stop it. But since it's only one frame and there's nothing going on in there, we don't need to stop it. We can just leave it. We don't need to write anything to our console. That was just kind of showing you how you can do it. I might point out different times to do that later on. But right now, we're just trying to make our simple back button work. So let's grab just one of the button code. It should be only, depending on your comments. Again, I'm just going to leave comments out this time. You're welcome to keep as many comments as you like. but I'm just going to grab these 3 lines. So it starts with this.button1.on and then tells the timeline what to do, and then it's the end of it all here. I'm going to copy all that. But when you have your actions panel open, you've got this bar on the left. And this bar on the left kind of shows you where you have code throughout the application. And things don't show up until you add code to them. So kind of the first time you add, you kind of have to manually go in there. But once you have, you're then able to switch between spots, and it automatically moves you in the timeline. So let me show you. For example, now inside this global dropdown, we don't need anything in there. Let's not worry about that. But we do have, we've got scene 1. It's showing us that on scene 1, there's code on frame 1. It's even showing us the home label here. And this is where it is. And if I close the actions panel, look, we're on scene 1, we're on this. Now, instead of manually going over to page 1, double clicking and going inside of it and clicking on the code thing and getting the code there, we could actually switch back and forth right here. Now that we already have some code, you can see we can go between frame 1, and then we can go to under our symbol definitions. We've got a page 1 symbol. We've got code on that frame. It switches back and forth. Now here's where sometimes it doesn't make sense to do this. Like once you've already got some code in there, if you're literally doing what we're doing, just trying to copy between the two, that's pretty good. But notice that, okay, so I'm here on the main timeline, but if I use this to go into the other page, and now I look at my action, I close my action so I can look at the stage, I'm in that symbol, but I'm not in context with anything else. It's just showing me that one symbol kind of floating on white, right? And we can't even see our name unless we were to make it an outline because it's actually in white. So that's kind of the one drawback of jumping around from symbol to symbol and timeline to timeline through the actions panel, is it takes you out of all context and just puts you there. Meaning the difference is if we start on scene 1 and manually go into it, it keeps context of what else is on other layers in the timeline, like this background and stuff. Does that make sense? So yeah, I do use that all the time, but just be aware that in the beginning, I don't use it much because I think it's easier to keep context and kind of understand where you are through this. But can be very helpful. So that being said, we have our button code copied. So I'm going to go down here. I'll put a space under it. You don't have to, but I like to space things out a little bit. I'm going to paste this button code. One thing to be very aware of when we talked about variables earlier is a variable scope. That word scope just means like where you're able to access the variable, where it has life, where it has meaning, right? It only exists, at least the way we're doing it. There's other ways to make global variables, which we may get into at some point. But the only way, or the only place that it's viable when we use the var keyword to start the variable is on the timeline that it was created. Okay, so we created a variable named timeline on this timeline, and we could kind of use it throughout this timeline if we wanted. But as soon as we're on a different timeline, by going inside of a symbol and our layers change, now all of a sudden, like if we didn't declare it again here, this would give us an error because it wouldn't know what the heck we're talking about. Okay, so that's really important to understand, and that's really kind of programming 101. The first step is understanding variables, how their scope works, and how the this command works. You can kind of pass information around and represent data and represent different objects. So along with showing you kind of exactly what we're trying to do here, I'm trying to give you as much kind of generic programming background as I can, that as you get into it, and if any of you kind of enjoy that side of things and want to look into it a little more, you'll have a little bit more of a well-rounded background as to why we're doing some of the things that we're doing to just make it work in this. Okay, so anyway, variables only can be defined, within any given timeline. Okay, so for us to do this, to tell something where to go, we're going to need a variable again to represent the timeline of the word this. At least we'll do it in this case. I'll show you maybe how we would use the this one instead of it to make what we're going to do work. But I think it'll make more sense this way. So Now we've got our variable timeline. Again, we don't need our stop command because there's no other frames here to play, right? It's just sitting on frame 1, which is really common when we're doing interactive, we're just making buttons. You don't always have a timeline going. First thing we need to do is we need to change the name of the button, all right? So this is talking about the current timeline we're on. So that also changed, right? Back in scene 1, this means this main timeline. But once we're inside of page 1, now this means this timeline that's inside of page 1. So that's how it's kind of dynamic. Doesn't always mean the same thing in the same place, right? That's why we have to create these variables. So now that we create this variable timeline that is representing the current timeline we're on, to control this button, the first thing we need to do is change its button name. So it's not named button 1, it's named back, right? Let's let me get back in context here. Well, I'm clicking around here a lot, but it's just something to get used to, is moving around your timeline and clicking in and out of different levels of symbols. That's what this game is all about. And the more comfortable you can get with that process, the easier it's going to be for you to kind of create your own layouts inside of this. All right, so I'm going to open up my code again. And well, actually what I was going to point out is if I unlock my back layer, select my back button and look at it, I can double check, yep, it has an instance name. I keep harping on that. I make the mistake to this day, after working this thing for 20 years, I still forget instance names. So it's named back, all lowercase. So that's what we need to do on our code. This timeline where we currently live, dot back, dot on, all right? So this is always just the name of the button, all right? This is the current timeline we're on. Again, we could use this, or we could say timeline, which means the same thing right now, at this level. And what I mean by at this level is anytime we're just right up against the numbers over here, it kind of means the timeline. As soon as we go inside of this click function, again, the word this no longer means the timeline, it then would mean the back button. And telling the back button to go to and stop a frame label doesn't make any sense. Right? So we need to use this variable once again to keep track of telling the timeline what to do. Now here's where our back button gets interesting, is, okay, we know that we want the back button to actually, if I go back here, we want it to go to this page. That's what we want to happen, right? And I talked about how before, if we were to throw a back button on this main timeline, it would work kind of the same way as all these 4 buttons do. And we would tell it to, the way we're telling these buttons to go to and stop a particular frame label, we would tell it to go to and stop home. All right, that's our frame label for our home page. That's really what we want, is we want to tell this button to go to and stop home. All right, but the problem is we're not on this timeline. Okay, so let me show you what happens. If I'm inside of here, and if I just say timeline.go to and stop home, which is what we want, you can change this into here. But the problem is it shouldn't do anything because it's looking for a frame label called home on this timeline. Okay, timeline is this, that's where we currently are, it's what we can currently see on the screen, and we're telling it to go to and stop home. Now, if I publish this and try it out, refresh it, go back in here, click back, nothing happens. In fact, I'm going to inspect. I don't think this should even throw an error because even though it can't find it, yeah, it's not even throwing us an error, which can be confusing. But it doesn't know that it can't find the label. That's something inside of Animate rather than native to JavaScript. I don't need to go into details. But what's important is that we need to learn how to tell the timeline above this one, or the parent timeline, what to do. And that's a really important step. Is so far with all of our buttons, we're just telling the current timeline that we're on what to do. So we could say timeline.stop. We could say timeline.go to and stop a specific label. We could even say go to and play a specific label and then stop it again on our own like we did at the end of our flip, shrink, and move animations. But what we want to do to tell the parent timeline, the one above it, We just have to add an extra piece to this line. We start on our timeline, but we say timeline, instead of timeline.goToAndStop, we say timeline.parent.goToAndStop. And this is called chaining commands together. So now we're chaining the timeline and the parent together and telling the result of that to go to and stop home. All right, so now we have a button that is on a completely different timeline and a completely different symbol and a completely different movie clip, and we're telling this timeline above it what to do. So now that should work. Once you add that dot parent, let me pull that back up for one moment here, and I'll test it out, make sure I'm not missing something, which is just part of programming, happens all the time. You just miss a little character or forget something and just have to debug it until you figure out what that is. So inside of this timeline dot back on click, so when we click it, inside of this function, we're going to tell it what to do. And what we're telling it to do is we're saying, okay, this timeline, the parent of this timeline, go to and stop home. Now if I file publish, refresh, go to Marvin, click back, and voila. Now we are no longer stuck in interface purgatory, and we can actually go back. At least from Marvin. We're still stuck on the other ones. We're going to handle that in a moment. All right, so I want to show you how to quickly and easily not have to do all of that again and just copy our button in the right way into these other pages so we can get back from all of them. So, all right, if it's working now, the quickest way, because we don't want to create it again, we don't want to set up all this code again, and even faster than we could, for example, select this code, we could copy all of this. So we've got all the code ready, and we could go into our next page, and we could make a code layer, and we could paste the code in. We could make another layer, and we could drag in our back button from our library and try and put it right in the right spot. But all that's extra work, all right? Most of the time, if we've already done something and we're just trying to reuse it, we should be able to copy it in some way. All right, so let me show you a different way to copy things. Right now, the only way I've showed you so far to copy things is to duplicate symbols. We've duplicated our buttons when we were creating them, so we set one up and then duplicated the others so we could just change the label or change the image, and all the other setup stuff would be there. I'm doing the same thing, and we've done the same thing with our movie clips, right? That we set the first one up, and then we kind of duplicated them and just changed the image to keep the structure. Well, rather than duplicating symbols, you've also seen how you can just regular copy and paste, whatever symbols or images or text or anything really, just like you can copy and paste in any computer program. You can just copy and paste things regular from layer to move things around. So that's important to understand. You can duplicate symbols to kind of use them as a template for another symbol. But the other way to copy things is you can actually copy entire layers and everything on them. And that includes code, that includes animation, that includes multiple symbols. It's really, really powerful to be able to copy entire layers and groups of entire layers. And that's what we're going to do to, as quickly and easily as possible, copy this back button into all the other pages so we can get back from all of them. Okay, so again, rather than just putting this back button on the main timeline where we would see it on all the pages, we put it inside of the page, and we're kind of putting that back button code once inside of each page, mainly just so we could see how going up a level and telling the parent timeline what to do, how that works. But it also is a little better because, again, we don't know which page the user is going to go to first, so we wouldn't know where to put the button code, so we'd have to put it on every page. And it would get a little confusing on this main timeline to have the same button code 4 times, and it makes a little more sense just to put it inside of the page. So anyway, go inside your page, and now all we're going to do is select both the code and the back button layers. All right, and I use Shift to select them both. You'll see they'll turn blue or highlight in some way. And when I have both the code and the back button layers, I can right-click and choose Copy Layers. And it's that easy. And that copies all of the code and the button and all of its positioning and its instance name and all that stuff. So now all I have to do, and this is good practice going in and out of levels again, your key is this breadcrumb trail up here. It can definitely be a bit overwhelming and confusing at first, but the more you do it, the easier it'll be. And once you become a little more comfortable with it, you'll be able to kind of visualize how to lay things out along one timeline and how to go deeper into other timelines and do a lot of things really powerfully, just kind of reusing the same button code over and over again. This breadcrumb trail kind of showing us where we're at. We're inside of page 1. That's where we copied our code and our back layers. And I'll go back up to scene 1 and go over to page 2. And right now I can see the breadcrumb trail just says scene 1. Now I double click. Again, I have to make sure my pages layer is unlocked. If my pages layer is locked, I can double click on this all I want. I'm not going anywhere. But as long as the layer is unlocked and I'm actually over that page where I can see it and I can see the keyframe, I can double click it and it takes me inside of page 2. Once I'm inside of page 2, I can right click over my top layer here, choose paste layers, and poof, the back button is there and the code got added. And because this is its own timeline, I can leave the button the same name. I can leave everything the exact same and it'll just work, okay? Because it works local to this timeline. And in any one of these movie clips now, we're creating a variable to represent the timeline. We are telling the back button what to do. And in each case, we're telling it to tell its parent timeline to go back to the home page. All right, so it's that simple. I'm gonna go ahead and it looks like I had them locked when I copied them, doesn't really matter. I'm gonna go back up to scene 1, go over to page 3, go inside of that, paste it in. Back to scene 1, go to page 4, double click inside of it, right click, paste it in. So just like that, I set up the button in one spot on one page and then was able to just copy the layers and paste the layers by right clicking the layer area inside of each of the other pages. So that back button in its code doesn't exist anywhere on this main timeline. You have to go inside of any of these 4 pages before I can get to it. The same way I'd have to go inside any of these pages to get to the image and the title here, right? And as you can see, now our pages are starting to get more complicated. Now our pages not only have an image and a title, but they also have a back button and code. And now it's starting to make a little more sense why we want this extra organization of being able to go inside a page and have its own independent set of layers that kind of organizes things separately from the main timeline. And you'll see later on, as we move on, we're going to actually animate these pages as an entire page at once and make some like transitions of things fading in and sliding around and stuff like that, and having them all contained in one symbol that we could just animate with tweens is going to be really powerful as well. So, you know, really starting to understand how organizing these things into these different objects that we can then control in different ways and different levels. It's a lot to process, but that's where the power of using this program is that there's a lot of layout and a lot of complexity you can do through this kind of animation methodology of using timelines and keyframes. Whereas if you weren't using a program like this and we're trying to build something similar on the web, you'd have to do a lot more coding with HTML and CSS just to even lay things out on the screen and make them change and stuff. I'm talking like a lot more coding. So this is by far the quickest and easiest and least complicated way to get things showing up, moving around, and clicking and being interactive on an actual web page. So that should work. I'm going to save my file because we've done a heck of a lot. I'm going to file save. And now after I've saved it, I'm going to file publish. And I'm going to refresh it. And now I'm going to see that now I'm no longer stuck in purgatory of any of these buttons. And as I visit Flopsy, and as I visit Muffin, as I visit Frodo, as I visit Marvin, I am always able to get back home. That's something that kind of keep an eye out on your wireframes and your final designs as well, is make sure you don't leave any areas where you would leave the user stuck in interface purgatory where there's no way to get out of a page. Make sure you can get back, or you can have like a nav bar and have the other pages you could get to available as well. This will kind of be our test application that in the end, you'll have a good working example of things you could reuse or even just repurpose this exact file with your own content to start building yours. So as we do this and as you follow along with me, I do want you to always kind of keep in your mind how you might apply these techniques to your own project and how you might lay out your own project.